Some people say shoegaze is genius. Others call it boring noise made by bands too shy to look up from their shoes. But one thing's certain, it changed alternative music forever. It revolutionised the way guitars were used in music and pushed vocals into the background. Yes, it took the spotlight away from the singers for a change.
It's all about me.
However, despite waves of devoted fans, critical acclaim, and enough fuzz pedals to launch a small spaceship, yes, that was a little nod to Kevin Shields' legendary pedalboard, shoegaze never conquered the charts, and because of this, almost faded entirely. Yet, that hardly mattered. Today, some of these bands are adored more than the artists who kept them off the top spots in the charts. But this adoration didn't happen overnight. It took time, a revival, and a new generation discovering the sound to get here. Right, eyes to the floor, we are off shoegazing. The origins of shoegaze, like every genre, are a little murky, although there are some clearly defined moments and influences. You could go as far back to Jimi Hendrix and say psychedelia played a part. I mean, it did. But if we move past that, you could point to bands like The Cure for their mix of melody and distortion. Then you could even say Joy Division for their sombre and moody tones. And Susie and the Banshees for their textured, atmospheric soundscapes. There are tons of other bands you could also link to the start of the genre, like the Pixies, Sonic Youth, and Dinosaur Jr. But look, if I was to name all possible influences, we'd be here for hours. However, the definitive beginnings are more often credited to the Jesus and Mary chain and the Cocteau Twins. The Mary chain combined minimal, feedback-driven noise with pop sensibilities, creating that signature haze of distorted guitars and detached vocals that would become a main indicator of the genre. The Cocteau Twins, meanwhile, sculpted ethereal textures with Elizabeth Fraser's angelic vocals layered atop cascading guitars, proving that atmosphere could become the centerpiece of a song, rather than the singer. Together, these bands created the sonic blueprint that shoegaze would build upon. Walls of sound, dreamy melodies, and a focus on texture over front and centre performance. Then came the band that would take the foundations and build the blueprint that every other band would follow. And every band would follow it like an instruction manual to a piece of flat pack furniture. This band would be My Bloody Valentine. Formed in Dublin in 1983, Kevin Shields, Belinda Butcher, Colin McKeeswick and Debbie Gudge started out with a sound that leaned more towards post-punk and gothic rock. But even then, you could hear the seeds of something different. Early releases like This Is Your Bloody Valentine in 1985 and the mini-album Ecstasy in 1987 showcased a band trying to set themselves apart and a band that was happy to experiment with texture, feedback and atmosphere. The band would then move to London, and after this, MBV began to absorb the noise pop influences in the scene. Kevin Shields, who was always obsessed with pushing the boundaries of guitar, started developing his signature technique, the glide guitar, where the tremolo bar and alternate tunings created swooping blared notes that felt like they were floating in a haze, rather than being played outright. By the late 80s, the band had begun to finalise the sound that would define the shoegaze era. Their first full-length album, Isn't Anything, dropped with a mix of abrasive noise and angelic melody, leaving critics stunned and laying solid foundations for what would come next from the band. By the time the band started planning their follow-up Loveless, MBV had already transformed the idea of what a guitar band could be, turning feedback, texture and obscured vocals all into a language of their own. But they wanted to push this more. The blueprint was drawn, the canvas was prepped, and the band was about to take 3 years and a small fortune to concoct what would become shoegaze's genre-defining masterpiece. Released in 1991, Loveless wasn't just an album, it was a 3-year labour of love, and let's be honest, a lot of craziness that nearly bankrupted Creation Records.
I've got nothing left. I've got nothing left.
And it definitely tested Kevin Shields' mental strength. The story of Loveless is as famous as its sound, with an estimated 19 studios used, countless engineers dismissed, as Shields trusted very few of them with the project, and endless experimentation. Shields obsessed over every single detail. This included the way that the tremolo bar bent a note, the precise layering of guitar textures, the subtle placement of Belinda Butcher's vocals so they felt more like another instrument rather than a voice. Shields wasn't just tracking songs, he was sculpting sounds, and it was very expensive. But every hour, every sleepless night paid off. Loveless didn't just create songs, it built an entire sonic world. Walls of fuzz and distortion shimmered like waves of colour, notes floated and blared into one another, and the vocals whispered, cooed, and vanished into the mix like the ghosts that haunt in Scooby-Doo.
Ghost? Ghost?
Before finally revealing themselves at key moments, but usually hiding in the mix. The guitars didn't play riffs, they created atmospheres. Every track was dense, chaotic, beautiful, and utterly unlike anything anyone had heard before. And here's the thing, it defined shoegaze, not just for MBV, but for countless bands that would follow. The blared vocals and the layers of texture, the interplay of noise and melody became the guide for all others in the genre. Ride, Slowdive, Lush, and countless others built their sound on the foundations Loveless had perfected. Here's a question for you. Can anyone name an album that so definitively established and ruled a genre? Please comment if you can think of one. When Loveless landed in 1991, critics were both mesmerised and bewildered. Select's Andrew Perry called it an album without parallel. Everything you hear confounds your idea of how a pop song should be played, arranged, and produced. Q's Martin Aston went further, saying it's a virtual reinvention of the guitar. Melody makers Simon Reynolds described it as the outermost, innermost, uttermost rock record of 1991. And Rolling Stone wrote that despite its ability to disorientate, the effect is strangely uplifting. The verdict was overwhelmingly positive, even if some had thought it was an unlistenable chaos. But most hailed it as genius. Either way, it set the bar so high that for decades, anyone calling themselves a shoegaze band was measured against this album's success. The thing is, that became a problem in itself, because how do you follow a record that already feels like the genre's final form? After Loveless, the shoegaze scene was packed with bands trying to find their own spin on the iconic walls of sound. Ride had already made waves with Nowhere in 1990, jangling yet dense, their sound flirted with psychedelia and Britpop, long before Britpop knew what to call itself. Slowdive meanwhile leaned into a dreamier, more ambient take, culminating in Souvlaki in 1993, an album that today feels like the spiritual twin of Loveless, but gentler and more intimate, while remaining equally rich. The early 90s briefly felt like shoegaze might stretch out into something bigger, better and more commercially viable, but the shadow of Loveless never really lifted. Critics couldn't stop holding every release up to MVV's masterpiece, and when it didn't measure up, they wouldn't be kind. By 1993 to 1994, shoegaze was suddenly labelled self-indulgent, style over substance, music for statues staring at their Converse. The unfortunate thing was Slowdive Souvlaki would become the punching bag for killing the scene. Enter the downfall of shoegaze. Just as shoegaze came about, the musical world turned its head. Bands that dressed in denim jackets, parkas, and had a stinking attitude turned up. Yeah, these guys. And suddenly, staring at your shoes wasn't cool anymore. Who knew looking at the floor wasn't as marketable as Liam Gallagher causing mayhem? The press, who only a few years earlier were hailing Loveless as a revolution, turned sharp and fast, bashing albums that, as we look back now, were masterpieces in their own right. Melody Maker absolutely destroyed Souvlaki, calling it sonic diarrhea, an insipid wash of sound that goes absolutely nowhere. And they weren't the only ones who were subjected to the press's Order 66 on the genre.
Execute Order 66.
Yep, that was a Star Wars reference. Shoegaze as a whole was suddenly branded insular, self-indulgent, and that was a kiss of death for any label trying to chase chart positions by pushing shoegaze bands. By 1995, the fallout was in full swing. Slowdive released Pygmalion to almost no fanfare and was subsequently dropped by Creation weeks later. Neil Halstead later reflected, "One week we were recording, the next we were told to pack it in. Things got so bad for Slowdive that they played one gig where the cleaners began mopping the floor before they'd finished playing. Yeah, that one must have stung." Ride imploded after the divisive Tarantula in 1996. Lush, in a bid to stay afloat, shifted gears entirely with Love Life in 1996 as well, trading lush textures for the currently dominating Britpop gloss. The term shoegaze became a punchline in UK press, shorthand for music that was too quiet to care about, too blurry to sell, and too moody to matter. Crowds weren't interested, labels walked away, and the sound that had once felt like the future was now irrelevant. Ironically, for a genre focusing on drowning the audience in waves of sound, was now drowned out by Britpop and grunge. A few bands tried to cling on in the underground scenes, but this seemed like it was it for the genre. Before we move on, if you are enjoying the video, please help me out by subscribing. It does mean a lot. If you don't, I'll get Kevin Shields to personally explain every single pedal on his pedal board to you, and you'll be there for hours. I'm only joking, but please subscribe. Anyway, after the death of the genre, shoegaze didn't completely vanish. It clung to life like Gandalf battling the Balrog on the bridge of Chasm Doom. Yeah, that was a Lord of the Rings reference. You're welcome. Small fanzines, niche labels like Claire Records and Sonic Cathedral, and the few who were still obsessed with the genre, kept the vibe alive. Across the Atlantic, US acts like Swirlies, Drop 19s, and Starflyer 59 carried the torch, cultivating cult followings, keeping the genre alive while also evolving with the times. Early 2000s tape tradings, bootlegs, and the first wave of MP3 sharing helped fans across the UK, Europe, Japan, and the US stay connected. Reissues of classics like Souvlaki and Loveless ensured that new listeners could finally hear these albums properly, and old fans could relive them with fresh ears. This caused the rise of experimental bands such as A Sunny Day in Glasgow, A Place to Bury Strangers, who pushed shoegaze into new territories, proving that the genre could survive, but survive by mutating to incorporate new elements, but while remaining recognisable. Meanwhile, small shoegaze festivals popped up in US college towns, Italy, Japan, and the UK, bringing scattered communities together and keeping the scene alive. During this underground period, some bigger names started citing shoegaze as a secret ingredient to their sound. Radiohead were clearly inspired by shoegaze in the OK Computer era, with their guitar lines reflecting the genre. M83 and others openly acknowledged their influence of MBV, Slowdive, and Ride. Back to the underground. Critics in niche publications like Friction or The Wire often praise the acts developing the genre for their innovation, even as mainstream attention remains scarce. The internet came and fan forums, early Reddit threads, and MySpace pages became digital fanzines, archiving forgotten albums, sharing live recordings, and fostering discussions that would lay the groundwork for something to come. By the 2010s, a new generation was ready to push boundaries further. Death Heaven's Sunbather in 2013 fused black metal with shoegaze textures, giving birth to a new subgenre, while other bands continued to blend other genres in as well, proving that shoegaze's influence wasn't just surviving underground, it was now expanding, and it was preparing to roar back. Grunge gaze, yes, I know that sounds crazy, entered the scene, and what we were witnessing was something completely unexpected happen. What had once been a niche that no one really cared about and had become the butt of critics' jokes had quietly become a lasting, global cornerstone of alternative rock. All it took was a lot of waiting for the world to catch up and for the next wave of artists to start staring at their shoes again. The moment that made it clear that the genre was rising again was when the original bands began to return, with all of them quickly reminding the world of why shoegaze had mattered in the first place. To continue my Gandalf simile from earlier, this is when we got Gandalf the White. Shoegaze came back, a stronger, more powerful version of themselves. I'll stop now.
Oh, thank God for that.
My Bloody Valentine emerged from nearly 2 decades of silence, performing live shows in 2007 that sold out in minutes, indicating that interest in their sound hadn't faded. Slowdive followed in 2014, reuniting for festival appearances initially, and eventually releasing their self-titled comeback album in 2017, over 20 years after Souvlaki, showing that their dreamy textures and shimmering walls of sound were back in fashion. The revival wasn't just about the old guard coming back either. A new generation of bands such as Dive, Nothing, Ringo Death Star, Bedroom, and Beach House, among others, took the genre's core principles and laid in newer sounds such as modern indie, post-rock, and electronic elements. The internet, which had preserved shoegaze in its underground years, became a megaphone for its revival. Social media, Bandcamp, and streaming services allowed these bands to reach global audiences instantly, while YouTube and Reddit continued archiving and sharing classic tracks. Fans could trace the lineage from MBV's gliding guitars and Slowdive's ethereal layers to the new acts keeping the genre alive and evolving. It was clear by the late 2010s shoegaze had fully reclaimed its place in the conversation. Shoegaze wasn't just nostalgia anymore, it was evolving, influencing contemporary indie, post-rock and electronic music, and showing that those walls of blared guitars and buried vocals still had plenty of room to expand in the future. You can't keep a good genre down. But where are we now? Did it come back in the late 2010s just to die out again? Actually, far from it. This isn't a sentence you probably expected to hear when I outlined the decline of the genre earlier, but Gen Z absolutely loves shoegaze. Thanks to the TikTok boom of 2022 to 2023, shoegaze streams have surged by 50%, with searches for the genre skyrocketing by 220%. Yeah, you didn't think you were getting stats in this video, did you? Classic tracks and hidden gems are being rediscovered and praised. One example of this is Duster's Stars Will Fall, which was originally released in 1997. But if you look at the views that this song has on TikTok, you can't tell me that shoegaze isn't back. Gen Z aren't just listening either. They're creating shoegaze for themselves. Acts like Phaser Days, Wisp, Julie, Narrowhead and Fleshwater are also taking shoegaze back to the indie rock scene, blending dreamy vocals and hazy guitars with modern twists that just keep the genre fresh and alive. The hybrid subgenres are thriving. The genre outlined by Deaf Heaven and similar acts is still continuing to grow. Emo gaze is connecting the hazy textures to rawer emotional vibes, and digicore-infused tracks from Jane Remover or Quanic show that shoegaze ethos can even blend in with hyper-modern electronic genres. Spotify's Shoegaze Now playlist has surged in listens by 800% in the 2020s, cementing shoegaze as an active genre, and even mainstream pop artists are citing the genre's influence. Billie Eilish has openly mentioned MBV as an inspiration, which is testament to the revival. Shoegaze seems to have finally removed itself from the shadow of Britpop and grunge and established itself as a mainstream genre. Gone are the days of empty gigs and ignored releases, and honestly, it's nice to see that change. Bands like MBV, Ride and Slowdive deserve their recognition, because what they did for music was nothing short of genius. Now with Gen Z acts like Phaser Days, Wisp, Julie, Narrowhead and Fleshwater bringing shoegaze back into the indie rock scene, and with hybrid subgenres thriving and viral rediscoveries hitting streaming charts, the genre is evolving more than ever. The guitars still shimmer, the vocals still drift, and the haze continues to inspire. So the question is, after the decades of underground persistence, critical scrutiny, and eventual revival, where will shoegaze go next? Will we see new sounds, viral moments, or directions that nobody saw coming? Only time and more fuzz pedals will tell.